Speaking a little more of the industry as a whole, I saw this article from Sean Nam over at Boxing Scene now, who I know he was at USA Today. I wonder if he's more at BoxingScene.com now. Sean Nam's a good guy to follow, by the way. But interview with Claressa Shields. And I want to just briefly talk about it because it's something that we've addressed before, so it's not a new information, but it's something that I think is a little bit apparent here. Claressa Shields, for women, more exposure in the UFC than in boxing. Quote, in MMA, there's just more exposure than women's boxing, Shields told Brian Custer on the Last Stand podcast. Quote, I hate to say it, for me, just looking at social media, for me, just seeing that they're the main event on every other card and people are coming and filling up arenas for them. We don't have that women's boxing. I haven't been on a pay-per-view yet, and I'm a 3-time division world champion. But Gervonta Tank Davis is about to be on pay-per-view. It's like, it's just not equal. And she goes on more and more. I do think you guys should all read a lot of this because I think it's all really, really good stuff. But again, go read the article from Sean Nam. I'm not going to take it all from him because I like the guy's work. Gary, speaking a little bit broadly here about the industry, about boxing, about how to fix women's boxing, because I think that we would really agree that Shields is right with this assessment.
Yeah.
Right. How do we get from point A to point B to fix this issue? Because it is an apparent fucking issue.
You know, I don't know if they're just uninterested, if it's an old school, good old boys mentality where they just don't take her seriously because she's a woman, or if they just think, like, as good as she is, and she's the best woman boxer ever, arguably, right? She's the most skilled, that's for sure. They just don't think her style is going to translate into stardom. I don't know which one it is, but, like, Eddie is doing a much better job with Katie Taylor, who's not half as good as Claressa Shields, and she's doing a much better job of making her a star.
They're even putting on like a Terry Harper main event.
Yeah,
Nacho Jonas. Like, when's Michaela Mayer been a main event on ESPN?
And none of these people can really shine Claressa Shields' shoes, right? Claressa Shields is way better than both those names, Michaela Mayer and Katie Taylor. She's way better. It's not even close.
Yeah.
And they've done a much better job with their women than you know has been done with Claressa Shields. I don't really understand. I mean, I can only see one of two options. Either they don't think her style is going to create any fans, it's just not interesting enough, or they just don't care because it's a good old boy society, you know, and it's like, she's not, it's just a woman. That's a sideshow. I don't know which one it is, but like those are the only two options I can come up, like the only two solutions or causes I can think of in my head.
I think it's a little bit of both, but quickly, I do want to self-correct myself. Michaela Mayer obviously just main event against Helen Joseph, but that was due to the main event falling off. I want to point that out too. But she did just main event for the first time because the main event fell out. I don't think Top Rank would have done that if they had to, or if they didn't have to. I don't think Michaela Mayer would be in the main event.
They would do it since that was a fun fight. It was an entertaining fight, and she looked good in the fight. Do you think they would do it again in the future? Do you think they'll fill a date with Michaela Mayer being the headliner? They might. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, look at who is running Top Rank. It's Bob Arum and Carl Moretti. Those are two guys that I would say are primary suspects, so to speak, in our industry being fucked up. Like, there's some of the worst people in this industry, if we're being completely honest. Is guys like them. Like, think of how Carl Moretti responds to questions about franchise belts and shit like that. Like, the guy has a flippant attitude about ruining the sport. So, I don't think he is like, oh, let's worry about Michaela Mayer. Let's start promoting women's boxing. No, he doesn't give a fuck. He doesn't care about that. He cares about his pockets. Bob Arum is old and on edibles all the time. He doesn't know or care. Like, let's just be honest. He is probably more the indictment of like the old boys club because he's just an old guy. Like, you know what I mean?
100 years old. Yeah.
I think the networks have are largely at fault for this. And look, even the UFC case, Dana White famously said on record numerous times, you will never see a women's fight in the UFC. He had disdain for women's fights. Ronda Rousey came around.
How long ago was that? That was before Rousey, obviously. How long ago was this?
A little bit over a decade.
Because it does take time. Like, first women boxing was like, okay, I don't want to see women get beat up. I just don't want to see that, right? Like, and it takes time. You do have to get used to it. I was not a fan of women boxing for a while because it just seems like I don't want to see a woman get punched in the face. Like I don't, but it takes time to grow on you, right? And then you say, okay, I mean, they're skilled and they have talent too. It's like any other sport. There's plenty of women who are good at this.
No, I do agree with that. Same with like most sports that just start. Like you need an evolution. Like I would never like if you tell me like, look, all of a sudden football is going to look like the 1930s and 40s. I'm like, fuck out of here. Like I'm not. No, fuck that with the leather helmets and it's all like 5'6" white dudes. Nope, I'm good.
They only run the ball up the middle.
think about that. Like no one would want to see that. Like same with like boxing, the UFC right now. If somebody's like, look, you're gonna go watch boxing's gonna turn into 32 rounders of drunk dudes on like barges and like shipyards, okay? And no one's gonna have like muscle definition, but they're gonna go for 32 rounds because they're just drunk and on cocaine all the time because cocaine's legal back then, right? Like that's how it is. I'd be like, no, fuck that. I don't want to see that. Like that sounds like the worst thing ever. That's bare knuckle boxing. No, fuck that. I'm good. It's like sports evolve. Sports get better. Like that's how it usually is. Same with women's sports.
Except for the WNBA, that's gotten no better.
No, it's gotten really good.
I haven't watched it in years.
Yes.
All right. I'll take your word for it.
Dude, you can't come up here and talk about mama mentality when his like dying wishes literally was that women's NBA would flourish and get more support.
That doesn't mean it's better though, and I understand that there are good players, and that doesn't mean that it's.
You really comparing it to like the 2000s, like mid 2000s. Remember that Disney movie that came out about women's basketball players? This might be
yes.
And it's, I think, a true story too. It's the twins, right? They were twins. I want to say it's based off a true story. Could be wrong about that. That era of women's basketball was not great. Just like I would say the 90s for women's soccer or football was probably not the greatest comparative to this last decade, which has been fantastic for women's soccer / football.
Women's soccer and tennis is well, I couldn't say objectively, but it's subjectively better than men's soccer and tennis. Like it just is. Like the flow of the game is better, especially tennis, right? Because they volley more, as men just try to slam it past. Like the women's tennis, just as a spectator, and I think tennis is a great sport. I don't think it's that much fun to watch, but I think it's a great sport. Women's tennis is better to watch than men's tennis because they volley more, right? The exchanges are longer.
That took evolution.
Yeah,
like all the sports that you mentioned took evolution. You know, like they didn't start off all of a sudden being great, and same with the men. But guess what? The men automatically get funding and investment and time on cards or times on events. You know, like that's the difference. You know, like a great male tennis player back when tennis started up didn't have to worry about getting shine because he's a dude.
For sure.
You know, it's obvious, right? I think to sort of take it back to boxing here, I think women's boxing has, I mean, blatantly, empirically improved over the last 5 years alone. Like the last 5 years of women's boxing has seen a massive explosion.
Yeah.
And that's due in large part to investing and funding of the sport. Okay, that has to continue. Not only that, it has to increase. If you look at the UFC and bring it back to that connection in MMA, we had Ronda Rousey coming to Showtime and Strikeforce, which was a competitor to the UFC, and do great ratings. Be on main events. You had Gina Carano be on main events. You had Chris Cyborg be on main events. You had this explosion of women's talent in only the span of like 3 or 4 years. And the UFC bought all those fighters, bought the rights to that promotional company, and took them all and created the UFC's women's divisions. Okay. Similar to that, the UFC bought up a all women's promotional company, and that promotional company, Invicta, is on UFC Fight Pass, and they have 12 cards a year, 1 card a month, and only women's fights. And the UFC invests and promotes that and pushes that. And guess what? It's a feeder league to the big leagues, and a lot of those fighters that are great in Invicta end up on the UFC roster. That's how it kind of should work in boxing to a degree. Like there should be these small promoters that get investment from the bigger promoters to put on these all-women's cards. Like a Lou DiBella, who's been talking about an all-women's card, should get funding from a DAZN or a Matchroom or whoever in order to make that card. And then you invest in it and you promote it, and it's a long-term strategy. That's what this should be.
I'm thinking that women's boxing is going to have their own platform, their own promotional outlet, because I mean, right now Eddie's the only one who I think is doing even a decent job at it, right? But like I think there's, and you're gonna have to get the women. If you get the women, the men will obviously follow. If your girl says to you, "Hey, let's watch the women boxing," you're gonna do it, right? But I think that if you had a women's promotional outfit who only promoted women's fights, I think they would obviously do a better job at it, and I think the sport would grow that way, as opposed to putting on one women's fight every 5 cards. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're not building any consistency with that. If there was a promoter who put on one women's card a month and then 2 a month, right, it would grow, and people would start to watch it consistently.
No, I agree. I do think like maybe like an Ann Wolf would be a great like figurehead. Maybe not obviously the person like funding the promotional company, but figurehead person on press events talking shit and promoting a fight. Hell yeah, I would get behind that 1,000%. But there needs to be some more formal backing of women, because otherwise the sport's not going to grow. They're all going to be looking at the UFC and women's MMA and being like, look, these women are treated the same because pay is relatively equal, not 100%, but it's relatively equal comparative to boxing. On top of it, they do get a lot more promotional in industry push from networks, from promoters, from media, from fans. It's just seen differently. Like I was talking to Real Niger chick, the longtime listener, right, of the show off air, about women's MMA, trying to put her on to fights, right? Because she doesn't like MMA. She was like, oh, it's too bloody. It's too much for me, right? That was her mindset. And I gave her a list of women's MMA fights because she's a huge women's boxing fan. And she became a women's MMA fan after that, because they were great fights. They were fantastic events. They were high-level, elite-level fights. Women's boxing doesn't have that deluge of events and fights I can or sort of pull back on and say, look, these are the fights that we should look at and say that women's boxing is great. And that's not because women's boxing isn't great. It's because there's no push in it. There hasn't been enough women's fights on events. There hasn't been enough women's main events. Luckily, I mean, I will give Eddie some credit to this. He has been pushing women's boxing a lot more than other U.S. promoters and other promoters in general in boxing, but it's still not enough.
They need their own promotional outlet. They need their own like the women's boxing series, the World Women Boxing Series, where it's nothing but women's fights on a women's card. Do them once a month to start with, and then go to 2 a month, and then you can build a fan base, right? Like, I'm not saying it's ever going to be as big as men's boxing. It probably won't be, but you can build a big enough fan base where the big time promoters will want a piece of that. Like you said with the UFC, he was against it until he saw you could make him money. Okay, well now I'm not against it anymore.
You should be looking at, not you obviously, but people should be looking at Claressa Shields, Katie Taylor, Cecilia Brækhus, even others like Stefan Pursoon, others that are regional stars that you can make money off of, and realize you can make money off of them, because you can. PSK in the chat is bringing up a great point. And equal funding in the amateur scene for both men and women will improve the pipeline into the pros. Absolutely agree with that. I think that would probably be a massive change to what we see right now. 1,000%. I want to echo that. Richard Carey in the chat saying putting women on men's cards gives a better chance of people watching it. Would people really watch a all women's card at the moment? Yes, they would. If the fights are good enough, then people would. And here's the thing. Because it's boxing and it's not MMA, it's not a direct comparison, right? Like Invicta and UFC never co-promote events. You don't see UFC or Bellator co-promote events. So that just doesn't happen in MMA. But in boxing, you have co-promote events all the time. So that all women's promotional company can easily co-promote with a Matchroom or a Top Rank or the bigger promotional companies, and then put their fights on that card. You could do that easily. Right? Like you can have co-promotional deals. Like let's say just call Invicta again, just for my own head clarity, because it's the MMA women's all women's MMA promotional company. Let's call it Invicta in boxing. If Invicta has co-promotional deals with Serrano and Brækhus and Taylor and Pursoon and Helen Joseph and Mayer, to where they can put them on all female cards and all women's cards, let's say New York or LA, when they can, when the timing is right. Or they can take them off to Top Rank or Matchroom and co-promoted deals and work that way. This shouldn't be an issue. Like the smaller promotional companies do this all the time. K2 does it all the time. Main Events does it all the time. Lou DiBella does it all the time. So why can't a Ann Wolf promotional company do that? They absolutely can.
That's what I'm saying. But they, it's like trying to get your product in Home Depot. It's like, well, why am I giving you space and I don't even know you can sell your product? You have to show them that I can sell first. And it's like, well, I need to have that for my stable. But the only thing I would say that is like Claressa Shields has already shown she can draw numbers, right? Because the numbers she did when she headlined a card on Showtime was the same number that every single ESPN card did, was like 350, right? So they have a fraction of the viewers, a fraction of the subscribers that ESPN has, but she put up the same numbers. So, like, what does that tell you? You know what I'm saying? Like, but that's what's weird to me. It's like Claressa Shields already showed you. Now the number wasn't great. It wasn't mind blowing, but it was okay. I mean, they have worse numbers than that. Jamal Charlo did a worse number than that, right? So, like, why wouldn't you go back to it? You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying you have to pay her millions of dollars, but just pay her whatever she deserves, whatever the fair market value is, and have her headline on the card, see how it does. I don't understand why they don't do that, right? Like,
I get why she was upset she was on that Showtime schedule. Even though it was just PBC fights and she's not a PBC fighter, I get why she was upset that she doesn't have a Showtime date because she's been fighting on Showtime for most of her career. Yeah. I get it. Like, she is a bigger name than all of those people on Showtime, right? And like, not the pay-per-view cards, but like the other fights, like Sergey Lepinets, Erickson Lubin, Nonito Donaire, in terms of viewership numbers.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. It's not like when she had her card that she headlined, it bombed. It did okay. I mean, it did fine. Yeah.
It did good. Like, it did good. Like, Showtime numbers doing 300,000, 400,000 in that range.
Yeah.
Those are kind of average numbers, to be honest. And she did on par numbers, where you can make money off of it. So it's just weird. I totally echo Claressa Shields' frustration, to be honest. Just wanted to highlight that. I feel like it's important. Moving on.